Happy 4th of July to all of you listening in the United States. As the fireworks go off and the barbecues get going, it's more than just a party, right? It feels like a good moment to pause and maybe reflect a little on what America truly is, especially right now. I mean, with all the national conversations and divisions we're seeing, understanding who we are seems, well, more critical than ever. So today we're going to take a deep dive into that very question. Is the United States, at its core, a democracy? Is it a republic? Or maybe something else? And crucially, why does this distinction even matter so much today? Our goal here is to try and cut through some of the noise. We want to unpack what the founders originally intended, look at how our government was actually designed, and examine some of the current challenges to those structures. We really want to help you understand the fundamental principles that define us.
That's exactly right. And it's definitely a complex topic, mostly because, we hear democracy and republic used almost interchangeably in everyday talk. It leads to a lot of confusion. But the sources we've looked at, they really highlight a critical foundational difference. It was central to how the founders saw America. So while, yeah, lots of people just say democracy, the United States was very deliberately designed as a republic, not a pure direct democracy. And understanding that difference, it's absolutely key to making sense of our past, our present, and frankly, where we might be heading.
That's interesting because I probably do use them interchangeably like most people, but you're saying the sources show this was a major point for the founders. What exactly was that difference for them, and why did they so clearly choose one over the other?
Okay, let's get straight to it. A pure democracy, it comes from the Greek, right? Demos, for people, kratos, for rule, literally rule by the people. And that kind of direct system, every eligible citizen votes directly on every law. The majority basically has almost unlimited power. And here's the kicker. The rights of minorities. They can be completely vulnerable, unprotected. Think about ancient Athens. We often hold it up as this birthplace of democracy. But it was also a place where, popular feeling could just swing wildly. They might execute generals one day, then completely change their minds the next. James Madison, he looked back at history at places like Athens, and he saw spectacles of turbulence and contention. That's how he put it. He saw these systems as really prone to instability, to factionalism, because there weren't any built-in brakes or mediating bodies to slow things down or filter the majority's immediate impulses.
Okay, so pure democracy is like driving without brakes, potentially.
That's a decent analogy, yeah. Now, a republic, that comes from the Latin res publica, the public thing. So in a republic, power is still held by the people, but it's exercised through their elected representatives. And critically, these representatives govern according to a charter, or in our case, a constitution. That constitution, that's the fundamental break. Its whole purpose is to limit government power and specifically to protect individual rights. It safeguards minorities from, the potential whims or passions of the majority. That's really the core insight. It's not just who rules, but how that rule is structured and limited. That's what defines a republic.
So the founders were basically saying, look, direct popular rule sounds good, but without some guardrails, it can actually be pretty dangerous to liberty.
Exactly. And it's really striking how intentional they were about this. You won't find the word democracy anywhere in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. But the word republic, it's definitely in the Constitution. James Madison hammered this point home. He said, in a democracy, the people meet and exercise the government in person. But in a republic, they assemble and administer it by their representatives and agents. And he argued that a pure democracy could only work in a tiny area, like a small town. A republic, though, could be extended over a large region.
Like the United States.
Precisely. And think about the Pledge of Allegiance, right? To the REPUBLIC, for which it stands. So, yeah, while we often call the U.S. a representative democracy, and it has democratic elements, its fundamental DNA, its structure is undeniably Republican.
Okay, knowing they were so conscious about direct democracy, I'm really curious now about the specific tools they built in. How did they actually engineer the American Republic to protect liberty from those dangers they saw? This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
It really is. They were aiming for what they called ordered liberty. They understood that a political community isn't just one monolithic thing. It has different parts, different interests. They wanted institutions that could refine views, put a brake on impetuous decisions, inject some reason into heated debates, and help make more far-sighted choices. Their real wisdom was in creating a system that acknowledged the valid contributions, by non- and even counter-majoritarian parts of the community.
Non and counter-majoritarian parts. What does that mean exactly?
It means parts of the government or society that don't just reflect the immediate will of the majority. Think institutions designed to slow things down or represent different interests. This whole idea was heavily influenced by Aristotle's concept of a mixed regime or a polity. Aristotle saw that societies always have different groups, like, lots of poor people and a few rich people. He argued that real political justice isn't owned by any one group, it's compound.
Hmm.
So the goal was to blend these different forces, these different interests, to make sure no single faction could just take over and define justice for everyone else.
Okay, so mixing it up to prevent dominance by one group. How did that translate into the American system? What were those key innovations?
Right. Several key American Republican innovations came out of this thinking, and many act as those crucial checks and balances we hear about. First, you have representation. This was absolutely vital for governing such a huge country. Within that, you have the House of Representatives. It's designed to be closer to the people, smaller districts, elections every 2 years, so it reflects more immediate public feeling.
Hmm.
But then you have the Senate. Longer term, 6 years, and importantly, 2 senators per state, regardless of population. The Senate was meant to be a more deliberative body, a sort of aristocratic element, in Aristotle's terms, to temper those immediate, sometimes impulsive majority desires coming from the House.
So one reflects the people more directly, the other provides more stability and represents the states.
Exactly. Second, there's the Electoral College. Now, I know this is probably the most controversial one for many people today, but from the founders' viewpoint, its purpose was crucial: to balance the national popular will with the reality of state sovereignty. It was designed to prevent a situation where a candidate could win just by appealing to a few very large cities or states, ignoring the rest of the country. It gives smaller states a proportionally larger voice than they'd have in a pure popular vote.
That's a point that really divides people now, isn't it? Whether that balance is still the right one.
It absolutely is. The core idea, though, was again about preventing a tyranny of the majority, in this case, a geographical majority, and ensuring broader representation across different kinds of states and regions.
Okay, what else?
Third, federalism. This is the whole idea of dividing power between the national government and the state governments. States keep significant powers, anything not specifically given to the federal government. This encourages diversity, allows states to be like laboratories for policy, and it makes it much harder for one single faction or interest group to capture the entire government nationally. It helps create a sort of Republican social order, not just a political one.
So decentralizing power is another check.
A huge one. And finally, you have the judiciary, especially the Supreme Court. It's explicitly empowered by the Constitution to interpret the law and, crucially, to protect individual rights against the will of the majority, if necessary. Think about landmark cases like Brown v. Board of Education, ending school segregation, or Loving v. Virginia, striking down bans on interracial marriage.
Right, where the court overruled laws that clearly had majority support in many places at the time.
Precisely. These cases show the unique power of a constitutional republic's rule of law to protect fundamental rights, even when unpopular. These aren't features of a pure democracy, they are specifically Republican safeguards. The aim was, as one scholar put it, to make the republic decent despite its being democratic.
Okay, this paints a picture of a really carefully, thoughtfully designed system, almost like a complex machine with lots of interlocking parts designed to prevent overheating, you could say.
That's a good way to think about it.
But it almost feels like today, some people are trying to maybe simplify that machine, or even bypass some of those parts. If the system was so carefully crafted, why are we hearing so much talk now about the fragility of democracy or concerns about democratic backsliding? I remember seeing a Pew Research survey from 2017, I think. It found something like 67% of Americans actually favored direct voting by citizens on major national issues. That sounds like a big shift towards direct democracy thinking. What's going on?
That's a really critical question, and it gets us right into this phenomenon experts call democratic backsliding. It's interesting, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote about America back in the 1830s, he kind of foresaw this potential problem. He worried about what he called an insatiable love of democracy, potentially undermining the Republican structures. He called it an egalitarian zeal.
Egalitarian zeal?
Yeah, this intense desire to apply the principle of equality to absolutely every aspect of life: social, family, religion, economics. The danger, he saw, was that this could lead to flattening essential distinctions and hierarchies that, maybe ironically, are needed to protect liberty. You see hints of this, maybe, in debates around things like participation trophies, blurring distinctions between sexes, challenges to traditional family structures, discomfort with economic inequalities, even blurring lines between student-teacher or citizen-foreigner. It's this impulse to level everything.
And how does that connect to the political system?
Well, this flattening impulse often translates into direct attacks on those Republican institutions we just talked about, the ones designed not to be purely majoritarian. So you get growing calls to abolish the Electoral College or get around it using things like the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. You see hostility towards procedural limits in Congress, like the Senate filibuster, because it can block a simple majority. You hear calls for term limits, expanding the Supreme Court, or relying more and more on ballot initiatives for major policy decisions. Often this comes from a place of misunderstanding or maybe just disregarding the original and even counter-majoritarian rationale behind these institutions. They're seen simply as roadblocks to what the people want right now.
So this egalitarian danger isn't just a cultural thing. It's pushing for this kind of direct, unfiltered majority rule that bypasses the very checks and balances the founders thought were essential.
That's a big part of it, yes. And it often stems from something else Tocqueville pointed out, what he called the theory of equality applied to minds. This is the belief that basically there is more enlightenment and wisdom in many men combined than in one man alone.
Sounds democratic.
It does, but if you take it to the extreme, if you assume all minds are truly equal in insight and wisdom, then the majority opinion doesn't just become policy, it almost becomes truth. It gains this outsized moral power, as Tocqueville put it, that can really silence dissent or minority viewpoints. And this perspective conveniently overlooks all those times in history when huge majorities supported terrible injustices like slavery or opposing women's right to vote or dragging their feet on civil rights. Despite these historical examples, some defenders of pure majoritarianism, they don't really rethink their basic commitment to the idea that the majority is somehow infallible.
Wow. So what are the actual symptoms of this democratic backsliding that experts are pointing to in the U.S. today?
Well, experts who track this stuff, like the group behind The Economist's Democracy Index, they've actually downgraded the U.S. from a full democracy to a flawed democracy in recent years.
Their democracy. Ouch.
Yeah. And they point out this erosion is often gradual. It's not usually a big sudden collapse, but more of a slow chipping away, often driven by political leaders themselves. Some key symptoms they highlight include: first, election manipulation. This isn't just about stuffing ballot boxes, which is rare. It's more about things like state legislatures passing laws that make it harder for certain groups to vote, or politicizing the administration of elections, or drawing electoral districts, gerrymandering in ways that basically predetermine the outcome and reduce real competition. Second, what they call executive aggrandizement. This means presidents, over time, trying to expand their own power, often at the expense of Congress. We see efforts to weaken the independence of the civil service, like that proposed Schedule F plan, which could have allowed a president to fire tens of thousands of career government experts and replace them with political loyalists. This undermines the checks and balances, especially if Congress itself is gridlocked and can't push back effectively.
So concentrating power in the executive branch.
Exactly. And third, there are growing concerns about judicial impartiality. The Supreme Court, in particular, has become highly politicized. Decisions narrowing voting rights protections or the court getting more involved in deciding elections, like back in Bush v. Gore, raises questions about whether the judiciary can still function as that impartial check it was designed to be.
This democratic backsliding, it sounds kind of academic, but it clearly has real-world consequences. We hear a lot in the news these days about things like Project 2025. How does a specific plan like that, based on what our sources describe, actually illustrate some of these challenges to a republic we've been discussing?
Right. Project 2025 is a very concrete example that touches on many of these themes. It's this huge, I think it's around 900-page policy agenda. It's basically a blueprint for what the authors themselves call a radical restructuring of the executive branch. It was put together primarily by former officials from the Trump administration and the Heritage Foundation, which is a prominent conservative think tank. Their stated goal is to prepare for a potential future conservative administration, laying out detailed plans to reorganize pretty much the entire federal government, department by department, to enact a specific conservative agenda from day one.
Okay, and what kinds of proposals are in there, according to the sources, that connect back to this idea of democratic backsliding or challenging Republican norms?
Well, our sources, including analyses from groups like the ACLU, point to several areas within Project 2025 that directly relate to the concerns we've just outlined. Now remember, we're reporting what the sources say about the project's contents, not endorsing any view of it.
Understood. Impartial reporting.
Exactly. So, for instance, the sources highlight broad proposals aimed at limiting voting access and potentially centralizing control over election processes at the federal level. This connects directly back to those concerns about election manipulation and undermining faith in the electoral process. Then there's the theme of executive aggrandizement. The project outlines plans for a significant expansion of presidential power over the executive branch. This includes the Schedule F idea we mentioned, reclassifying potentially thousands of career civil servants as political appointees who could be fired at will.
Which would bypass traditional civil service protections.
Precisely. The sources also mention plans described as potentially abusing surveillance powers and using federal force against protesters in ways that could impinge on First Amendment rights. These all point towards concentrating power in the executive and weakening checks. Beyond those structural points, the project details numerous specific policy goals that critics argue would significantly roll back established civil liberties and rights. Examples cited include using the old Comstock Act to try and ban abortion medications nationwide, implementing mass deportations, ending birthright citizenship, reversing LGBTQ+ protections, and heavily restricting what can be taught in schools about race and gender. From the perspective of republicanism, the concern here is the potential for a powerful executive pursuing a specific agenda to override constitutional checks or disregard protections for individual and minority rights that might conflict with that agenda.
And the connection to the previous administration is quite direct.
Very direct, according to the sources. They state that at least 140 people who contributed to Project 2025 had previously worked in the Trump administration. And the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, has apparently described their mission as institutionalizing Trumpism and has also advocated for overturning the 2020 election results. So yes, this initiative clearly represents a detailed, concerted effort to reshape the executive branch based on a specific ideology, raising flags for those concerned about the balance of power and democratic norms.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. This is definitely a lot to take in, especially on a day like the 4th of July, which is meant for celebration and thinking about our nation's founding. But, if understanding our past and our present is really the key to figuring out the future, what does the research suggest we as citizens can actually do? How do we work to uphold these Republican principles? What's the path forward to, as Benjamin Franklin supposedly put it, keep the Republic?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And the sources, especially when they draw on observers like Tocqueville, offer some really vital insights. It's not just about structures, it's also about character and culture. First, there's the idea of cultivating Republican character. This isn't automatic. It needs practice. Tocqueville emphasized the importance of fostering a taste for freedom and self-government. How do you do that? By participating. Things like serving on a jury, getting involved in local community associations, town meetings. These grassroots activities build the habits and the civic virtue needed to resist potential tyranny, whether from a ruler or a majority.
So being an active citizen in small ways actually strengthens the whole system.
Absolutely. Second, and this might sound a bit counterintuitive today, the sources suggest we need to reappreciate difference, including intellectual inequality. Now, this isn't about endorsing unfairness or prejudice. It's about recognizing that different people bring different perspectives, different levels of insight, and that's valuable. It pushes back against that equality of minds idea we discussed. One suggestion from the sources is actually exposing ourselves to what they call aristocratic literature. Thinkers like the ancient Greeks and Romans, Plutarch, Polybius, Cicero, Livy.
Okay, aristocratic literature might sound a little daunting or frankly old-fashioned to some listeners. What's the practical takeaway there for navigating today's world? How does reading Plato help with, say, online misinformation?
Fair question. It's less about finding direct answers to modern problems in ancient texts. It's more about cultivating a certain temperament. These writers grapple with the complexities, the uncertainties, the hard trade-offs inherent in politics. They don't usually offer easy, one-size-fits-all solutions. Reading them can help cultivate patience, an appreciation for nuance, an ability to live with political disagreement, and maybe even some irresolution. It helps develop a mindset that's at home with the persistence of political problems, rather than constantly seeking immediate, absolute fixes, which is often the impulse in a purely democratic mindset. It builds mental resilience against simplistic narratives.
So it's about developing perspective and maybe a bit more intellectual humility.
Exactly. Third, the importance of institutions and norms just cannot be overstated. Effective resistance to democratic backsliding relies on having strong institutions, social trust, and political elites committed to upholding democratic norms. It's crucial that leaders across the political spectrum are willing to defend the rules of the game, even when it's inconvenient for their side. When elites stop doing that, when they tolerate or encourage norm breaking, it really weakens the whole foundation.
Right. It requires buy-in from the top, not just the grassroots.
Precisely. And finally, maybe most fundamentally, active citizen participation is still the bedrock. Voter turnout matters. Staying informed matters. Engaging respectfully with different viewpoints matters. Holding elected officials accountable matters. It's about engaging with the system thoughtfully, understanding its Republican design, its strengths, and its vulnerabilities, and participating in ways that uphold it not just during election season, but continuously.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels clearer than ever that America's identity, especially on this 4th of July, isn't just a simple label, democracy or republic. It's more like this dynamic, ongoing project, a commitment to maintaining a very specific, carefully balanced set of principles and institutions.
That's exactly right. The nation's strength, its unique character, really lies in that complex, sometimes messy system of checks and balances. It was designed quite deliberately to protect individual liberties and minority rights from the potential downsides of unchecked majority rule. It's a constant pursuit of what Aristotle might call that compound justice, blending different interests and perspectives rather than aiming for some fixed, perfect ideal imposed by one group. It's built to manage conflict and diversity, not eliminate it.
Which brings us back to that famous story about Benjamin Franklin, right? Leaving the Constitutional Convention, someone supposedly asked him, well, doctor, what if we got a republic or a monarchy? And Franklin's reply, a republic if you can keep it. So maybe the final thought for all of you listening today as you celebrate is this. What does it truly mean for you to actively participate in keeping it? Beyond just voting, how can we understand and uphold this delicate balance of our Republican institutions and the diverse, sometimes conflicting viewpoints they were designed to accommodate? That seems like a question worth reflecting on not just today, but every day.